She wore that necklace for 7 years, unaware that it contained enough evidence to wipe out an entire empire. And tonight, with a gun pointed at the temple of the man she loves, Seraphina Vale finally understands the most horrifying truth. Her father didn't die in an accident. He died because he knew too much. And now, all of Europe is hunting her. If you're watching this video, please like it. Leave a comment about the city you're watching in so I know how far this story has come. And don't turn off the screen, because this is just the beginning. The rain came down in sheets over Milan that October, the kind of cold, relentless rain that soaked through wool coats and turned the cobblestones black and slick under the glow of street lamps. It was not a night for outdoor balconies. It was not a night for open-toed heels or silk dresses that cost more than a semester of rent. And yet, Seraphina Vale stood at the edge of the Castellano estate's main terrace, her bare arms catching the mist from the gardens below, staring at the city like it owed her something. She hadn't wanted to come back. That was the part nobody understood. Not her mother's friends with their practiced condolences, not the old colleagues of her father who kept touching her elbow and saying things like he would have been so proud. Not even the hired string quartet playing something baroque and suffocating in the grand salon behind her. Nobody seemed to understand that returning to Milan after 3 years in Boston didn't feel like homecoming. It felt like being dragged back to the scene of a crime. She reached up and pressed 2 fingers against the hollow of her throat, feeling the familiar weight of the necklace. A thin gold chain. A small pendant shaped like an asymmetrical star, one of the points slightly longer than the rest. Her father had pressed it into her palm the morning she left for medical school, his hands rough and warm, his eyes doing that thing they always did when he was trying to say something he couldn't put into words. She'd assumed it was sentiment, grief at watching her go. She hadn't asked questions. She should have asked questions. "You're letting the champagne go warm." The voice came from her left, and she didn't startle, which surprised her because the voice was the kind that should have made her turn fast. Low, unhurried, the voice of a man who had long since stopped caring whether people paid attention to him, because they always did. Seraphina turned slowly. I was leaning against the stone balustrade about 6 feet away, a cigarette between 2 fingers, the ember end glowing orange in the dark. I wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the city below, the cathedral spires lit up gold, the canal cutting a black ribbon through the old quarter, the distant flash of headlights on the Via Monte Napoleone. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in a way that his tuxedo couldn't quite conceal, and his hair was silver at the temples, dark everywhere else, and slightly damp from the rain. He looked like he'd been standing there a long time and planned to stay longer. She'd seen him inside. Hard not to. He was the kind of man rooms reorganize themselves around. She'd watched 3 separate conversations stall mid-sentence when he walked through them. She'd watched her mother's eyes follow him with something that looked dangerously close to fear. "I don't drink champagne at memorial galas," she said. "Smart." He took a drag, exhaled slowly. The champagne at these things is always overpriced and underchilled, a passive-aggressive choice on the host's part. She looked down at the glass in her hand. He was right. It was nearly room temperature. "Are you always this observant about other people's drinks?" "I'm observant about most things." He finally looked at her then, and she felt it the way you feel a draft from an open window. Sudden, unexpected, impossible to ignore. His eyes were dark, the kind of dark that absorbed light rather than reflected it. There were lines around them that didn't come from laughing. "You've been out here for 11 minutes. You've been counting. I've been watching." He said it without apology. "You came out when Signora Ferrante started talking about your father's charitable legacy. You've touched that necklace 4 times since you walked through the door. You've spoken to exactly nobody who wasn't already blocking your exit path. And you're wearing shoes that cost at least 3,000 euros on a terrace with drainage grates every 2 meters. He glanced down at her heels. "That's either carelessness or performance." Seraphina stared at him. "Which is it?" he asked. She should have walked back inside. That was the rational response. Instead, she heard herself say, "Who are you?" He took another drag. The rain picked up slightly, and neither of them moved. Lucien Moretti. The name landed like a stone into still water. She'd heard it before, fragments, whispers, the kind of references adults make around children when they think children aren't listening. Moretti's people. That's a Moretti arrangement. Once, years ago, she'd heard her father say the name on the phone at midnight, and the tone of his voice had made her stomach drop even through the closed door. She'd been 16. She'd never asked about it. I know who you are, she said. Most people do? He didn't seem pleased by it. And yet here you are, still standing here. You haven't given me a reason to leave. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile. Nothing that clean or simple. More like the first signs of weather changing. He looked back at the city, and for a moment the only sound was rain on stone and the muffled music from inside and the distant low rumble of the city going about its ordinary life. Your father was a careful man, Lucien said. The warmth dropped out of the air. Don't. Her voice came out sharper than she intended. I'm not eulogizing him. I'm stating a fact. He flicked ash over the railing. Emilio Val was the most careful man I ever knew. He never did anything without calculating the cost 3 moves ahead. It was his greatest quality and his most exhausting one. A pause. I was sorry when he died. Seraphina's jaw tightened. Were you? Yes. You didn't come to the funeral. No. He didn't explain. He just let the words sit there, and somehow that was worse than any excuse he could have offered. She turned to face him fully. She was 23 years old and had grown up watching men like this move through her world, like weather systems, unavoidable, overwhelming, impossible to reason with. She had spent the last 3 years in Boston specifically to escape that gravitational pull, and now she was standing in the October rain talking to the most dangerous one of all, and the worst part, the part she would lie awake later examining with clinical precision, was that she wasn't afraid. She was interested. What do you want, Moretti? He looked at her again, that same draft of cool air. Right now? He dropped the cigarette and pressed it out with the toe of his Oxford. Nothing. I came out here for the same reason you did, to breathe. He straightened, tugged his jacket sleeve down over his watch. But I'd like to finish this conversation sometime when we're not both pretending to be somewhere we don't want to be. Then he walked back inside. Seraphina stood on the balcony alone for another 4 minutes. She counted. Her mother found her at the coat check at 11:15, catching her arm with the kind of grip that looked gentle from a distance and wasn't. Genevieve Vale was 51 years old and beautiful, the way expensive things are beautiful, with obvious effort and no apology for it. She was wearing black Valentino and a smile that had never once reached her eyes in Seraphina's memory. She'd been performing composed, dignified grief for 18 months, and she was very good at it. You spoke to him, she said. Not a question. For 5 minutes. Seraphina kept her voice flat. On the balcony. It was raining. I know where it was. Genevieve's fingers tightened on her arm. Seraphina, listen to me. Whatever he said to you, he talked about the champagne. He doesn't talk about champagne. Her mother's voice dropped, clipped, and precise as a scalpel. That man does not make small talk. If he spoke to you, he had a reason. And I need you to understand, I need you to actually hear me, that his reasons are never good for anyone but himself. Seraphina looked at her mother's face. The fear there was real. Under all the composure and the practiced elegance, Genevieve Vale was genuinely afraid, and that was so unusual, so startlingly out of character, that it stopped Seraphina cold for a moment. What aren't you telling me? She asked. This isn't the place. Her mother released her arm, smoothed her own sleeve, reassembled her expression. We'll talk tomorrow. Come home tonight. I'm staying at the apartment. Seraphina, Mom. She said it quietly, but with the particular weight that had been building for 3 years of distance and silence. I'm 23. I'm a medical student. I came back for 1 week because you asked me to. Don't make this something it isn't. Genevieve looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes that Seraphina couldn't name. He is not a man you recover from, she said finally. Then she turned and walked back into the light. The apartment her father had kept in the Brera district smelled like his aftershave and old paper, and the smell hit Seraphina the moment she unlocked the door like a physical thing, like a hand against her chest. She stood in the doorway for a full 30 seconds, breathing through it, before she went inside. She didn't turn on many lights. She found a bottle of red wine in the kitchen cabinet, poured a glass she barely touched, and sat on the floor with her back against the cold radiator, the way she used to when she was a teenager and needed to think without the furniture getting in the way. The apartment was exactly as her father had left it. Her mother hadn't touched it. Seraphina didn't know if that was grief or something else. She held the pendant between her fingers, an asymmetrical star, 1 point longer than the rest, slightly thicker. She'd worn it so long she'd stopped seeing it. She pressed the back of her thumbnail along the longest point and felt, for the first time, what she must have pressed past 100 times without noticing. A hairline seam. A ridge so subtle it was basically invisible unless you were looking. She wasn't looking. Not really. She put the necklace down on the coffee table and drank her wine and told herself it was nothing. Old jewelry had quirks. Clasps wore down, settings shifted, metal developed seams from years of contact with skin. It meant nothing. She left it on the coffee table and went to bed. She didn't sleep. He called her the next afternoon. She didn't know how he had her number. She stared at the unknown Milan exchange on her screen for 3 rings before answering, and somehow she knew before he said a word. The Navigli, Lucien said without preamble. There's a restaurant called Dal Pescatore. Old place, nothing special on the front. Tonight at 7. Come alone. You can't just call people and tell them where to show up. I know. A pause. Are you coming? She should have said no. She had a list of reasons to say no that stretched longer than the canal itself. He was 50 years old. He was connected to organized crime in ways she only partially understood. Her mother had looked genuinely frightened for the first time in Seraphina's living memory. She was only in Milan for a week. She had rounds to get back to, a residency application due, a life she'd spent 3 years carefully constructing at a safe distance from everything this city represented. 7 o'clock, she said. The restaurant was exactly what he'd described. A narrow door on a narrow street, no signage worth noticing, dim lighting inside that suggested the place had been here long enough to stop caring about attracting new customers. A man at the door recognized Lucien immediately and showed them to a table in the back without being asked. Nobody bothered them. The kind of privacy that came not from discretion, but from understanding. Lucien ordered for both of them in Italian, so fluid and casual. It was clear this was not performance. This was just his language in the way that all languages are the language of the place that shaped you. He wore a dark jacket and no tie, and he looked, she thought, significantly less untouchable than he had on the balcony. Not softer, just more visible. They ate for a while without saying much. He asked her about Boston in a way that suggested he already knew the broad strokes and was filling in detail. She answered honestly, which surprised her. She told him that she liked emergency medicine because it demanded presence in a way that other disciplines didn't. You couldn't drift, couldn't half attend, couldn't let your mind wander toward past or future while someone was hemorrhaging in front of you. She told him that she missed her father more in Boston than in Milan, which was unexpected and painful and true. She told him the apartment still smelled like him. Lucien listened. He was, she realized, genuinely good at it. Not the performative nodding of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but actual attention. The kind that took things in without immediately processing them into responses. How did you know my father? She asked. He refilled her wine glass. Business. What kind of business? The kind that's easier not to label. He set the bottle down. Your father and I had an arrangement for almost 10 years. He had access to information I sometimes needed. I had resources he occasionally required. It was functional and professional, and we both understood its limits. He paused. I liked him anyway, despite all of it. What kind of information? Lucien looked at her steadily. The kind that got him killed. The restaurant noise seemed to dim slightly. Seraphina set her fork down. The official report said cardiac arrest, she said carefully. I know what the official report said. Are you telling me that's wrong? I'm telling you your father was 54 years old, had a clean cardiac history, worked out 3 times a week, and died 6 days after telling me he'd found something he described as, I'm quoting exactly, the kind of thing that doesn't stay buried. Make of that what you will. Seraphina's hands were very still on the table. She'd learned that from him, from her father. This particular stillness that was not calm, but was the body's emergency response to information too large to process standing up. What did he find? I don't know, Lucien said it plainly. He wouldn't tell me over the phone. He said he needed to secure it first. He said he had a way of keeping it safe that nobody would think to look for. His eyes moved to her collarbone. Not the way men's eyes usually moved there, but lower, deliberate, landing on the pendant. He died before we could meet. The pendant. The hairline seam. The point that was slightly longer, slightly thicker than the rest. Seraphina's hand moved toward her necklace before she could stop it, and she watched Lucien watch her do it, and she knew from his expression that he'd been waiting for exactly this moment. Not with calculation, but with the particular patience of a man who knows the truth will arrive eventually if you don't rush it. He gave this to me the morning I left for Boston, she said. Her voice was very level. 3 years ago. I know. How long have you known? Since last week. He held her gaze. I had people look into his affairs after the anniversary. There was a gap in his records. A secure file transfer the week before he died that was sent nowhere on record. A payment to a specialty manufacturer in Geneva. A beat. Microdata storage, embedded in jewelry. The pendant felt suddenly different in her fingers. Heavier, like it had changed mass without changing size. You came to the gala for me, she said. Yes. Not to pay respects. I came to pay respects. And to find you. He didn't soften it. Both things were true. She should have been furious. Part of her was a cold, clear thread of anger running underneath everything else. He'd approached her with intention. He'd had his reasons, and the reasons predated their conversation on the balcony, predated his call this afternoon, predated her standing in her father's apartment touching a seam she'd never thought to press. But underneath the anger was something worse, the nauseating, vertigo-inducing recognition that everything she thought she knew about her father's death had just been handed a question mark. What's on it? She asked. I don't know. Take a guess. Lucien was quiet for a moment. Outside, a tram passed on the street, the metal grind of it cutting through the silence. Your father was a forensic accountant before he built the Vale Group. He spent 15 years tracing money, corporate, private, occasionally less legitimate. I was extremely good at it, and he knew where to look in ways that most people don't. He rested his forearms on the table, leaning forward slightly. The people he was connected to in the last year of his life, not through the business, through other channels. They are not the kind of people who accept loose ends. Who are they? People who can make a cardiac arrest look like a cardiac arrest. Seraphina breathed. In, out. Her father's face on the morning she'd left. The roughness of his hands. The thing behind his eyes that she'd read as sentiment. And now, with savage hindsight, decoded as something else entirely. He'd been saying goodbye. Not the ordinary kind. The permanent kind. The kind you say when you're not sure you'll still be there to say the other things. He'd given her the necklace. He'd hidden it in the thing she would never take off. The thing nobody would think to search because it looked exactly like what it appeared to be. A father's gift to his daughter. He'd trusted her with it without telling her what she was carrying. He protected me by keeping me ignorant, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes. And now you've made me not ignorant. Lucien held her gaze. Yes. Which means the protection is gone. He said it quietly, without softness. I know. I've been sitting with that for a week. Seraphina looked at him across the small restaurant table with its half-eaten food and its ordinary wine and its nothing special ambiance, and she felt the floor shift beneath a version of her life she'd believed in right up until this moment. Not dramatically, not the way it happened in films, just a quiet, final, irreversible shift. The ground settling into a new configuration while she stood on it and couldn't stop it. Her hand closed around the pendant. I need to know what's on this, she said. Yes. And then what? And then, Lucien said, we figure out what your father died trying to tell the world. He paused. If you want to. You could also get on the first flight back to Boston tomorrow morning and never open it. She looked at him. Would that keep me safe? The silence was its own answer. Nobody who found out about this chip from the Geneva records would know whether you'd opened it yet, he said carefully. You could play ignorant. You just said the protection is gone. I said the comfortable ignorance is gone. He leaned back. That's not the same thing. It was, though. She knew it, and he knew it. The moment she'd pressed her thumbnail against that seam, some mechanism had started moving. She could feel it the way you feel a change in barometric pressure. Not with your eyes, not with your hands, but with the animal part of the brain that learned long before language to sense incoming weather. Her phone buzzed on the table. She looked down. Her mother. Calling for the third time since 7 o'clock. She let it ring. Lucien watched her do it. He didn't comment, didn't push. He just sat there in the dim restaurant light, waiting, and she understood for the first time why people feared him. Not because of the violence or the money or the organization that reportedly moved behind him, like a shadow of a shadow. But because he was patient in the way that very few people were truly patient, not strategic patience, not the performance of waiting while internally pressing, just actual, genuine stillness. It terrified her. It also made her want to stay in this restaurant until they turned off the lights. Her phone went quiet. The voicemail icon appeared. "I'm not going to Boston," she said. Lucien said nothing. "I need a way to open the pendant without damaging whatever's inside." "I know someone." "Of course you do." She finally picked up her wine glass. Her hand was steady, which surprised her. "And then what? We extract it, we see what my father hid, and then we're both standing over something that apparently gets people killed." "That's an accurate summary. You're not exactly selling this." "I'm not selling anything." He looked at her directly, and she noticed again the lines around his eyes, the specific quality of exhaustion in them that came not from sleeplessness, but from decades of carrying weight he'd chosen to carry. "You can walk out of this restaurant right now. I won't follow you. I won't contact you again. I'll handle it myself, whatever's on it." "And if you handle it yourself, what happens to it?" "It gets used, or it gets buried, depending on what it is." "Used by who? For what?" He didn't answer, which was, itself, an answer. Seraphina set her glass down. "No," she said. "No, what?" "No, you don't get to take my father's work and make it yours." Her voice was level and precise, and she was mildly shocked by how certain it felt. "Whatever he found, whatever he hid it with me. That wasn't an accident. He chose me." She paused. "I'm not walking away from that." Lucien looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the rain had started again, lighter now, tapping against the restaurant window in a rhythm that sounded almost patient. "All right," he said. "All right? We do this your way." He reached into his jacket and placed a small card on the table. No name, just an address in the Porta Genova district and a time. "Tomorrow morning, my associate will extract the chip without damaging it." She picked up the card. The address was in handwriting that was precise and slightly angular, the writing of someone who'd been taught penmanship by someone demanding. She turned the card over. Nothing on the back. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. The question sat there between them, heavy and honest. Lucien was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "Because your father was the only man in 20 years of doing what I do who treated me like I had the option of being different." He picked up his wine glass, looked into it rather than at her. "He was wrong about most things, in the end, but not about that." A pause. "I owe him." Seraphina watched his face. He wasn't performing this. It was too sparse to be performance. No narrative arc, no redemptive framing, just a flat fact dropped into the open air and left there. She nodded once. She tucked the card into her coat pocket. She did not look at his hands when she reached for her bag, which she would later identify as the moment she should have made herself look and assess the situation with clinical detachment, the way she'd been trained to assess, and instead she thought about her father pressing the cold gold chain into her palm and saying, "Don't lose it." Sarah and she had promised she wouldn't, and she never had. She stood up. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "Tomorrow morning." She walked out into the Milan rain, her heels ringing against the cobblestones, her hand pressed flat over the pocket where the card was, the pendant cold against her sternum, and somewhere in the old city behind her, her mother was leaving voicemails she hadn't opened yet. She stopped at the end of the street, took out her phone, opened the voicemail. Her mother's voice came through immediately, not composed, not careful, stripped of all the practiced grace that was Genevieve Vale's permanent public face. Raw and rapid and afraid, in a way Seraphina had never heard from her in 23 years. "Seraphina, listen to me. Don't go home tonight. Don't go back to the apartment. They've already been there. Someone was in your father's apartment. The building manager called me an hour ago. I don't know what they were looking for, but I know why. And I need you to hear me. Whatever Emilio left you, whatever you're carrying." A sound in the background. Sharp. A door. Then silence. Then the line went dead. Seraphina stood in the October rain with her phone pressed hard against her ear and listened to the silence on the other end, and she understood with sudden, terrible clarity that she had approximately 30 seconds to decide which direction to run. She called him back before she'd finished listening to the voicemail a second time. Lucien picked up on the first ring. "Someone was in my father's apartment," she said. Her voice was flat and controlled in the way she'd learned to keep it when presenting a trauma case, effects stripped down to function. My mother called me. She said, don't go back. Then the line cut. A pause. Not hesitation. Processing. Where are you right now? End of Via Corsico. In the rain. Don't move. Another pause. Shorter. Don't take a cab. Don't use a rideshare app. Walk north on Corsico until you reach the tabacceria with the blue awning. It's about 90 meters. Wait inside. I'll be there in 12 minutes. My mother, one thing at a time. His voice was measured. Not soft. Measured. Is the call completely dead or did it break up? Dead. Mid-sentence. Okay. A beat. Walk north. Tabacceria with the blue awning. Go. She went. The street was mostly empty. A couple under an umbrella moving in the opposite direction. A dog pulling its owner toward a lamppost. The ordinary nightlife of a neighborhood that didn't know anything had shifted. Seraphina walked fast, her heels loud on the wet stone, the pendant bumping against her sternum with each step. She counted her breaths the way she did in the emergency bay at Boston General when a case came through the doors and she needed her hands to be steadier than her heart rate. In for 4. Out for 4. Repeat until the body agreed to behave. The tabacceria was exactly where he said it was. Its window displaying lottery tickets and a rack of candy bars, fluorescent light bleeding yellow onto the wet sidewalk. She pushed through the door and the bell above it rang once, small and domestic. An old man behind the counter looked up at her without particular interest and went back to his racing form. She stood near the door, watching the street. 11 minutes later, a dark car pulled to the curb. Not a flashy car. Something German and understated, the kind of car that said, money in the same way a good suit said money. Not by announcing itself, but by having no reason to. The passenger door opened from inside. She got in. Lucien pulled away from the curb immediately. He'd changed. No tuxedo, dark sweater, jaw shadowed with the kind of stubble that accumulated over a long day. He drove with one hand loose on the wheel, scanning mirrors with the mechanical regularity of someone who'd been doing it so long it had passed through habit into instinct. Tell me exactly what she said, he said. Seraphina recited it, word for word. She had the ability to play recordings back. Her neuroanatomy professor had called it exceptional working memory. Her father had called it the gift of paying attention. Lucien listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. She said they've already been there. Yes. Not someone was there. They. Yes. He changed lanes, checked the mirror again. How long has your mother known what your father was doing? Seraphina looked at his profile in the darkness of the car. I don't know. Think about it. Not what she told you. What you observed in the last year before he died, the year after. Any change in how she behaved around the business, around his associates. She thought about it. Really thought, not the reflexive my parents didn't talk about those things deflection. She'd been offering herself for 2 years. She thought about Genevieve's face at the funeral. Not grief, or not only grief. Something harder and more guarded. The way she'd started keeping the house staff to a minimum. The way she'd mothballed her father's apartment rather than dealing with it. The way she'd flinched, just slightly, at the gala tonight, watching Lucien cross the room. She knew something, Seraphina said. Not everything, but something. And she didn't tell you. No. To protect you. Or to manage me. It came out sharper than she intended, and she heard the old resentment in it. 3 years of distance compressed into a syllable. Those two things looked the same from the outside with her. Lucien didn't comment on that. He turned onto a wider road heading northeast, away from the center. I'm taking you to a property I keep in Lambrate. It's not connected to my name directly. You'll be safe there tonight. And my mother? I have people who can locate her. She's not a package. I know what she is. His voice didn't rise. She's a woman who just had her home searched by people who make cardiac arrests look like cardiac arrests. Finding her quickly is not an insult to her. It's the fastest way to make sure she's still breathing by morning. He glanced sideways. Do you want me to locate her, or do you want to argue about methodology? Seraphina pressed her back into the seat. Locate her, she said. I'm out a call, one hand on the wheel, phone against his ear, a brief exchange in Italian that she followed about 60% of. Enough to understand names were being checked, locations being pinged, someone being dispatched. He hung up. 20 minutes, he said. Neither of them spoke for a while. The city moved past the windows in streaks of orange light and dark glass. Seraphina watched it and thought about her father's hands on the necklace chain and felt a feeling she didn't have a clean diagnostic code for, somewhere between grief and fury and the particular cold clarity that settled over her sometimes in a crisis when there was nothing to do but think. The people who searched the apartment, she said, how did they know to look? They've probably been watching the apartment since your father died, waiting to see if anyone came back for it. For a year and a half? Patient people. He turned off the main road. Or people who didn't know exactly what they were looking for until recently. Something may have changed, a new connection made, a record accessed. These things move in their own timeline. And my coming back to Milan moved the timeline. He said it plainly. I'm sorry. She looked at him. He was watching the road, and the streetlight caught the angle of his jaw, the steadiness of his hands, the specific quality of a man who has navigated situations like this often enough to stop pretending there's a clean way through them. Did your people coming after my father's records move it first? She asked. The car didn't slow. His expression didn't change, but she saw his grip shift slightly on the wheel, an infinitesimal tightening. Yes, he said, probably. So your investigation accelerated the risk to me. Yes. She waited for the caveat, the justification, the construction of context that made it less than what it was. It didn't come. I should have moved more carefully, he said. I underestimated how closely the apartment was still being monitored. You underestimated, and now someone broke into my father's home and my mother is missing. Your mother's phone went dark, which is not the same as missing. And yes, I made a mistake in the speed of my approach. He pulled into a narrower street, older buildings on both sides, less light. That's what happened. Seraphina turned back to the window. She was furious. She located the fury with the same precision she applied to everything, examined it, and let it occupy its proper space without letting it make decisions. It was not a feeling she could afford to act on right now. Later, she would find a room and stand in it alone and let it out properly. Not now. Tell me about the property in Lambrate, she said. It's a ground-floor flat in a building I hold under a holding company, 3 entities removed from my personal name. The neighbors don't know me. There are 2 exits. I keep it stocked for situations requiring discretion. You keep it stocked? Yes. How often do you use it? Not as often as I used to. A beat. Fewer situations requiring discretion these days. That's a retirement speech. Something crossed his face, almost amusement. It's a factual statement. Is it true that you're stepping back from whatever it is you do? Whatever it is I do. He repeated it without inflection. I run several legitimate import businesses and a property development group. And the other things? The other things are winding down. He turned into a courtyard, cut the engine. Have been for 2 years. Seraphina looked in the building. 4 stories, old stone, ground floor windows with heavy shutters. Ordinary. The exact texture of ordinary that indicated careful selection. Why? She asked. Because I'm 50 years old and I'm tired. He said it the way people say things they've said before, only in their own heads. Slightly too direct, lacking the performance of casualness. Because I have built enough enemies, and I don't want to build more. Because, he stopped. Because what? He got out of the car. She got out of the car. The flat was exactly as described, bare and functional, the furniture selected for utility rather than comfort. A full kitchen stocked with the basics, 2 deadbolts on the front door, and a secondary exit through a laundry room at the back. He showed her both exits without being asked. She noted them the way she noted exits in every new space, which was a habit her father had taught her, and which she'd never examined the reason for until now. She sat at the kitchen table. He put a glass of water in front of her. She drank half of it. His phone rang. He stepped into the next room. She heard the exchange in Italian, brief, factual, ending with what sounded like directions. When he came back, his face had shifted slightly, not dramatically, but the lines around his eyes were doing something different. Your mother is at her sister's house in Porta Romana, he said. She arrived approximately 40 minutes ago. She's not answering her phone, but the lights are on. The air came back into Seraphina's lungs. She's okay. For now. He sat down across from her. She knew to go somewhere not directly connected to her. She's more prepared for this than you realized. I know. Seraphina pressed her palms flat on the table. I just told you that. You told me she knew something. There's a gap between knowing something and knowing to go dark and relocate within 90 seconds of a threat. He looked at her steadily. Your mother has either been prepared for this scenario for some time, or someone prepared her. Or she watched my father prepare for it and learned by proximity. Possible. He didn't dismiss it. Can you reach her through a number the people who searched the apartment wouldn't have? My Aunt Petra's landline. I haven't called it since I was a teenager. Use my phone. Don't use yours from here. She took his phone. The weight of it was different from hers. Heavier, older model, the kind that had been chosen for security over design. She dialed from memory, which she could do because she had the recordings in her head, the numbers and sequences, and her aunt's voice saying, "Pronto." On a Sunday afternoon when Seraphina was 15 and calling from the study because she'd fought with her mother and needed somewhere to be. The phone rang 4 times. Her aunt picked up on the 5th, and before Seraphina could speak, she heard her mother's voice in the background, sharp and immediate. "Is that Sarah? Give me—" And then the fumble of the handoff. "Seraphina." Her mother's voice was controlled now, the public face reassembled, but underneath it was the raw thing from the voicemail. Still there, still running. "I'm safe," Seraphina said. "Are you hurt?" "No, I'm fine." A breath. "Where are you?" "Somewhere safe." "Mom, I need you to tell me what you know." Silence. Then, "Not on this phone. You're on your sister's landline." "I don't care." Her mother's voice dropped further. "Seraphina, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Whatever he told you tonight, whatever Moretti said, I need you to understand that man has his own interests, and they are not yours." "He told me Dad was murdered." A long pause, longer than Seraphina had prepared for. "Mom, I know," Genevieve said, and the 2 words were so small and so devastated and so long held that Seraphina felt the table solid and real under her palms and was grateful for it. "I know what happened to your father." "How long have you known?" "Since 3 months after the funeral." A breath that shook slightly at the edges. "A man came to the house. He said he was a colleague of your father's from his early career. He told me that Emilio had been building a record for 2 years. Documentation of a money laundering system connecting people I can't name on this line. He told me that the record had been secured and hidden. He told me that if I wanted to stay alive, I needed to not look for it and not let anyone believe I was looking for it." "Who was the man?" "I don't know. I never saw him again." A pause. "He was not a good man." "But the advice was sound." Seraphina looked across the table at Lucien, who was watching her with that particular stillness of his, reading the half of the conversation he could hear. She turned slightly away. "Did you know about the necklace?" she asked. Another pause. This one different. Not the pause of withheld information, but the pause of something clicking into place. "He gave it to you the morning you left," Genevieve said slowly. "Yes. I thought—" Her mother stopped, started again. "I thought it was just his way of sending you off. He loved you so much, Sarah, you have to understand. I know he did." Her voice came out rough and she didn't fix it. "I know, but he put something inside it. Data, evidence, whatever he found." Dead silence. "Oh, Emilio." Her mother said it so quietly it was barely sound. Not anger, not grief. Something older and more complicated. The exasperated tenderness of someone who understood a person completely and still couldn't reach them across the distance of a decision already made. "Mom, I'm going to open it tomorrow. I need you to stay where you are and stay dark. Don't use your phone, don't go back to the house, don't contact anyone in Father's business circle. Do you understand?" "You're not going to open it." Her mother's voice hardened immediately. "Seraphina, listen to me. The moment you access that data, you become a target with a timeline. Right now, they're still uncertain. They search the apartment because they're searching everywhere. If you open that chip and they find out, they're already treating me as a target, Mom. You said it yourself. The apartment was searched." "Searching an empty apartment is not the same as—" "I know what it's not the same as." Seraphina pressed her free hand flat on the table. "I know, but I'm not going to carry this for another 3 years without knowing what it is. Dad died for it. I'm not going to—" She stopped, regulated. "I'm not going to leave it buried." A long silence. When her mother spoke again, her voice had changed into something Seraphina recognized but couldn't quite name. Some frequency she'd only heard a handful of times, usually when Genevieve Vale had decided something and was done negotiating. If you're going to do this, she said, you're not doing it with only Moretti's resources behind you. What does that mean? It means I have people too. A pause. Your father wasn't the only careful one. Another pause. Give me until morning. Don't open the chip until I've made contact. Promise me that. Seraphina looked at the wall, thought about her father in the study at midnight, the low, worried shape of his voice through the closed door. Thought about the way he'd smoothed the chain against her neck that morning, careful and exact, making sure the clasp was secure. Until morning, she said. She hung up. She set Lucien's phone on the table between them and looked at him. She knew, Seraphina said. I heard. She's been sitting on it for 18 months. She survived 18 months, Lucien said. That's not nothing. She has her own people. Seraphina studied his face. Did you know that? I suspected it. He leaned back. Your father wouldn't have left her unprepared. He left me carrying a data chip and a piece of jewelry without telling me what it was. He left you protected in the way he thought would work best. Lucien held her gaze. Whether you agree with his method is a different question. Do you agree with it? No. He said it without pause. I think he should have told you. I think keeping you ignorant was a choice he made to protect himself from having to involve you, and he dressed it up as protection for you. Those are not the same thing. A beat. But I didn't know him the way you did, and I wasn't facing what he was facing. Seraphina looked at him for a long moment. That's the most honest thing anyone said to me about my father since he died, she said. Something moved across his face, brief and undefended. Get some sleep, he said. I'll take the couch. You don't have to. I know I don't. He stood up, moved toward the small closet near the entrance where a folded blanket sat on the top shelf, the stocked flat, prepared for exactly this, and he pulled it down without ceremony. Sleep. Tomorrow is going to be long. She stood. She was almost to the hallway door when she stopped. Lucien. He turned. Why did you really come to the gala? She asked. Not the full answer. The first one. He looked at her for a moment, the lines around his eyes doing the complicated thing again. Because your father used to talk about you, he said. In the years we worked together. Every time things got bad, every time the pressure came down on him, he'd talk about Seraphina in Boston, who was going to be a doctor, who was going to save people, like it was the fact of you that kept the rest of it from swallowing him. He paused. I wanted to see if you were real. She didn't have anything to say to that. She went to bed and lay in the dark of an unfamiliar room, listening to the city outside and the quiet sounds of a man she'd met 14 hours ago moving around in the next room. And she pressed the pendant flat against her sternum and thought about her father in the last year of his life, building his careful, hidden record, believing that the fact of her was enough to keep the dark from winning. She didn't sleep for a long time. Morning came in gray and cold, the light through the shuttered windows striped and pale. Seraphina was at the kitchen table when Lucien emerged from the front room at 6:40, still in yesterday's clothes, his hair slightly disheveled, the silver at his temples catching the kitchen light. He looked tired. He looked, for the first time since she'd met him, like a man who was carrying more than he was showing. He put coffee on without asking. She didn't object. They were halfway through it when his phone rang. He looked at the screen. His jaw tightened slightly. Not much, but enough. He answered. A brief exchange, Italian, his voice dropping lower and more careful the way voices do when information is being received that needs to be controlled on the way in. He hung up. What? She said. My associate in Porta Genova. He set the phone down. The one who was going to open the pendant this morning. What about him? He's in the hospital. Lucien's voice was level. Too level. The kind of level that was working hard. Beaten badly enough that he won't be working for several days. It happened last night, around 11 o'clock. Seraphina set down her cup. After I left the restaurant. Yes. They knew you were going to him. They knew something. He stood, moved to the window, looked through the gap in the shutters at the courtyard. Either my conversation was monitored, or they've been watching my known associates as well as your father's property, or someone told them. He turned from the window. Yes. Who knew you were going to him? No one. His expression was contained, but something underneath it was moving. I decided in the car, after you called me. I hadn't told anyone. Then they were already watching him. or watching me closely enough to know where I go when I need technical work. He moved back to the table, picked up his phone, and made another call. Shorter this time. Harder. He hung up. I'm moving the technical extraction to a different location, someone I trust more deeply. How deeply? Enough. He looked at her. But this changes the shape of things. They're not just watching property anymore. They're watching movements, people. How many people are we talking about? I don't know yet. He sat down. For a moment he looked at the table, and Seraphina watched the process of a man recalibrating. Not panicking, not performing calm, just actually recalculating with the new information the way an engineer looks at a load-bearing wall that's developed a crack. The original group connected to your father's records. There were 3 names I identified through my own investigation. Small organization, technically precise, politically connected. Not prone to wide operational footprints. He paused. This feels wider. What does wider mean? It means someone has either grown their operation significantly in 18 months, or someone else has become interested in the same asset. The chip. The chip. Seraphina looked at the pendant lying on the table between them where she'd set it when she sat down. Such a small thing. The asymmetrical star, the slightly longer point, her father's rough hands and his careful eyes. There's something else, she said. Lucien looked at her. My mother said she has people. She said to wait until she'd made contact. Seraphina picked up the pendant. She called me 20 minutes ago while you were in the shower. She said she's coming here. A pause. Here. She said she knows where here is. Seraphina held his gaze. Which either means she tracked your car, tracked your phone, or she already knew about this property. The silence in the kitchen had a different quality now. Seraphina watched Lucien's face move through something. Not suspicion, not quite, but the precursor to it. The moment before a man who has survived by reading people correctly starts reading a situation he thought he understood and finds different text. Your mother knew about this flat, he said. Not a question. Apparently. How? I think, Seraphina said carefully, that you and my father may have shared more infrastructure than either of you discussed with the other. She set the pendant down. I think my mother may know things about your arrangement with him that you don't know she knows. The sound of a car pulling into the courtyard below cut through the kitchen. Lucien was on his feet before it stopped, at the window, looking down through the gap in the shutters. His posture changed. Not alarmed, but loaded. The particular readiness of a body that has spent years distinguishing between threats and non-threats in the first 2 seconds of an unknown arrival. Then he stepped back from the window. Black Mercedes, he said. 2 passengers. Seraphina stood. She knew the car before she saw it. She'd grown up being driven to school in that car, in that particular shade of black that her mother had always preferred because it was the color that showed the least about the weather outside. The knock at the door was 4 raps, brief and certain. Lucien looked at Seraphina. She looked at him. In the 20 seconds it took for either of them to move, she understood that the morning had just become something different from what either of them had planned, and that whatever came through that door would change the shape of the next 12 hours in ways she couldn't map yet. She crossed the kitchen. She opened the door. Her mother stood in the doorway in a dark coat, no luggage, her hair pulled back severely, her face stripped of every performance Seraphina had ever seen her wear. Behind her, slightly to the left, stood a man Seraphina had never seen. Heavy-set, 50s, the quiet look of someone professionally invisible. Genevieve Vale looked at her daughter for exactly 1 second with something in her face that Seraphina would spend years trying to find the right word for. Then her eyes moved past her to Lucien Moretti standing at the kitchen table, and her expression reset into something colder and more precise. We need to talk, Genevieve said. All 3 of us. And before we do, she reached into her coat and placed a small photograph on the kitchen table beside the pendant. Black and white, slightly grainy. A surveillance image. You need to know what is already on its way to Milan. Seraphina looked at the photograph. In it, stepping off a private plane at what appeared to be Linate Airport, flanked by 2 men whose body language said armed and professional in every language simultaneously, was a man she had never seen before. Elegant, late 50s, a face like a blade. His name is Vittorio Salazar, Genevieve said. He landed 40 minutes ago, and Seraphina, her mother's voice, for all its control, developed a hairline fracture at the edge. He is the man who ordered your father's death. The photograph lay on the table between all three of them. The pendant lay beside it, and outside in the gray Milan morning, somewhere in the arriving city, Vittorio Salazar was already moving. Nobody spoke for 4 seconds. Seraphina counted them the way she counted everything. Not deliberately, just the way her brain worked, cataloging time and space, and the precise measurements of silence, the way other people cataloged feeling. 4 seconds. The photograph on the table. The pendant beside it. Her mother's face stripped to its architecture. Lucien behind her, still as a fault line before it moves. Then Lucien said, "How did you get this image?" "I have someone at line 8, Genevieve said. She stepped fully into the kitchen, the man behind her following and positioning himself near the door with the professional discretion of someone who had done this particular thing. Stand near doors in difficult rooms, many times before. A contact Emilio established years ago. When Salazar's flight plan was filed last night, I was notified. When last night? 11:40. Lucien's expression moved. After Seraphina called me. Yes, you didn't call us. Genevieve looked at him with the particular focused patience of a woman who has spent decades managing rooms full of people who underestimated her. I was in the process of relocating and verifying my daughter was safe. I'm calling you now. 40 minutes after he landed. Would you have preferred I arrived faster with less information? She pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down without being invited. Sit down, Moretti, both of you. I have things to tell you that will require you to be sitting. Seraphina sat. She was aware of Lucien sitting beside her, the warmth of him in the cold kitchen, the way his breathing had gone very controlled, the sign, she was beginning to learn, that he was most alert. Genevieve placed her hands flat on the table. No bag, no notes, nothing to hide behind. A deliberate choice. Vittorio Salazar ran the Meridian Group for 19 years, she said. Publicly, it was a financial management firm based in Luxembourg. In practice, it was the central processing organ for laundered capital from 8 separate criminal networks across Europe: arms, narcotics, human trafficking, political corruption at the ministerial level in 4 countries. She paused. Your father found it by accident. I was auditing a property development fund in 2019 and noticed a discrepancy in the disbursement records. He traced it backward for 2 years before he understood what he was looking at. Why didn't he go to the authorities when he understood it? Seraphina asked. Because the authorities were in it. Genevieve's voice was flat. Not all of them, but enough. He didn't know which ones, and the ones who weren't, he didn't know how to reach them without the information traveling first to the ones who were. Lucien leaned forward slightly. So he built the record to make it too large to suppress. Yes. He spent 8 months compiling everything onto the chip. Transaction records, account numbers, names, dates, wire confirmations, correspondence. Not just Salazar. Everyone connected, the entire architecture. She looked at the pendant. Enough to take down a system, not just a man. Seraphina looked at the small gold star lying on the kitchen table. She thought about her father bent over his desk in the late hours, building his careful demolition charge piece by piece, and wearing his face at breakfast like none of it was happening. She thought about all the mornings she'd eaten toast across from a man who was quietly preparing to blow up a continent's worth of criminal infrastructure. And she'd talked about her coursework, and he'd listened and asked good questions, and none of it had shown. I was going to give it to you, Seraphina said to Lucien. That's what you said. He was going to meet you. Yes. But he died first. Yes. She looked at her mother. And you've known since 3 months after the funeral that it was Salazar. I knew a name. Genevieve's jaw tightened. I didn't know where the evidence was. I didn't know it was on the necklace. I spent 18 months assuming it had been found and destroyed, which is why I stayed quiet and stayed alive. She paused. And then you came home. And then I came home. And apparently that moved several things simultaneously. Genevieve's eyes moved to Lucien. Including you. The look that passed between Lucien Moretti and Genevieve Vale was not simple. It was the look of 2 people who had been aware of each other's existence for years through the medium of a man they both cared about, and who were now in the same room for the first time without that man as buffer or interpreter, and who were in the process of deciding, in real time, how much to trust what they saw. I'll ask you directly, Genevieve said to him. What is your interest in the chip, finishing what Emilio started? That's not an interest, that's a mission statement. Her voice was precise and bloodless. What do you get from it? Lucien held her gaze. Salazar has been running operations that intersect with mine for 12 years. When he moves into a market, he uses a method I'm familiar with. He manufactures pressure on existing operations until they collapse or consolidate under him. He's been building toward Milan for 2 years. A pause. If Emilio's evidence goes public, Salazar doesn't go to prison. Men like that don't go to prison. They go to war. But it destroys the Meridian Group's financial architecture, which is the mechanism he uses to consolidate. Without it, he's dangerous, but not expanding. Another pause. I want him contained, not for clean reasons, for practical ones. Genevieve considered this. The man by the door shifted his weight infinitesimally. That's honest, she said finally. I try to be when the alternative is less efficient. Something almost moved in Genevieve's expression. Not warmth. Something more complicated than warmth. Recognition, maybe. All right, she said. Then we need to move faster than I planned because Salazar landing in Milan means the timeline has collapsed. He doesn't travel personally unless he's closing something. Closing it how? Seraphina asked. Her mother looked at her. He's here to find the chip, she said, and to make sure neither of you can use it afterward. The next 2 hours were the most compressed and functional of Seraphina's adult life. Lucien made calls, Genevieve made calls. The man by the door, whose name was apparently Marco, and who said nothing that wasn't operationally necessary, went and came back with a change of clothes for both women and a laptop bag that he handed to Lucien without comment. The second technician Lucien had contacted was a woman named Daria, who arrived at the flat at 9:15 carrying a shoulder bag that looked like it belonged to an architect. Wide, flat, with organized interior pockets. She was perhaps 40, with close-cut hair and the kind of neutral professional effect that, in another context, would have read as customer service, and in this context read as surgical. She sat up on the kitchen table without acknowledging the emotional residue in the room, which Seraphina respected enormously. The pendant, Daria said, and held out her hand. Seraphina unclasped the chain for the first time in 3 years. The cold of the kitchen hit her throat where the gold had been, and the feeling was so specific and so sudden that she had to breathe through it for a second before she placed the pendant in Daria's palm. Daria examined it under magnification for 3 minutes. Then she selected a tool from her bag that looked like a modified dental pick, hairline thin, and pressed it with extraordinary delicacy along the seam Seraphina had found with her thumbnail. The longer point of the star opened. It was a hinge, so fine and perfectly fitted that even looking directly at it, knowing it was there, Seraphina could barely see the mechanism. Inside the hollow point, embedded in a sleeve of shock-resistant polymer, was a chip so small it sat on Daria's gloved fingertip like a grain of black rice. Everyone in the room was very still. Daria transferred it to a reader, connected the reader to the laptop with a shielded cable. Typed. Wait. The screen populated with a file directory that Lucien leaned over to read and said quietly, Christ. How much there? Seraphina asked. Thousands of files. Daria scrolled without expression. Transaction records, correspondence, account structures. This goes back. She scrolled further. 2017. 6 years of records, Lucien said. Everything. Genevieve's voice had gone very quiet. He kept everything. Seraphina looked at the screen. Column after column of numbers and names and dates, the vast impersonal ledger of her father's 2 years of meticulous, secret demolition work. She thought about the weight of carrying it, not the chip, the knowledge. Walking into rooms full of these people, shaking their hands, attending their dinners, and knowing exactly what they were while building the case that would end them. The specific loneliness of that. We need to get this to someone who can act on it, she said. International authorities, press, both. I have a contact at the ICC, Genevieve said. A prosecutor. I've been holding his number for 18 months, not knowing if I'd ever have something to give him. Is he clean? Lucien asked. As clean as anyone gets at that level. She paused. Emilio vetted him, years ago, before any of this. Your husband did a lot of preparation for contingencies you didn't know about, Lucien said. His voice was neutral, not accusing. I know. Genevieve held his gaze. I've made my peace with that. Can we transmit from here, or do we need to move the physical chip? Seraphina asked. Daria looked up from the laptop. I can set up an encrypted transmission. It'll take 40 minutes to prepare the package correctly. You don't want to send raw files. They need to be structured so they're immediately actionable, not just a data dump someone has to sort for 6 months. 40 minutes, Lucien said. 40 minutes. He checked his watch, looked at Marco. Something passed between them. Not words, just the compression of a long professional understanding into a single look. Marco took out his own phone and stepped into the back hallway. What is it? Seraphina asked. If Salazar is already in Milan and he's moving on us. Lucien chose his words with visible care. The window between now and transmission is the most dangerous 40 minutes of the last 18 months. How would he know where we are? Lucien was quiet for 1 second too long. Seraphina felt it, the quality of that second. Lucien. There may be a leak, he said, in my network. I don't know where yet. My associate at Porta Genova being beaten was too precise. They didn't just find him, they timed it to cut off our extraction option before it was used, which means they knew the plan within hours of my forming it. He met her eyes. That's not surveillance. That's inside information. Who knew about Porta Genova? 3 people in my organization. His voice was controlled, but she could hear the thing moving underneath it. The cold fury of a man who has built trust carefully over years and is now examining it for fractures. I'm in the process of determining which one. In the process, her mother said, meaning you don't know. Not yet. So we're transmitting Emilio's evidence from a location that may already be compromised, Genevieve said, to a contact at the ICC using my phone, which has been in a known location for the last... Use my line, Daria said without looking up. I have a clean channel. It's not connected to any of you. Everyone looked at her. I'm not a charity, Daria added, but I knew Emilio Valle. He came to me 4 years ago needing a very specific piece of hardware built. He told me it was for a purpose that would cost him everything. She kept her eyes on the screen. He was right, so finish it. The room settled into a different kind of quiet. Seraphina looked at the chip in its reader. Her father's everything, distilled to a grain of black rice on a borrowed laptop in a flattened lambrate that smelled like practical necessity and old stone. She thought he would have found this funny, in the dark way he sometimes found things funny, the enormous consequence of the very small object. She thought he would have been afraid. She was afraid. She was locating it in her chest the way she located fear in patients, the elevated respiratory rate, the hyper-awareness of peripheral space, the way her hands were very deliberate in their movements because the alternative was letting them shake. She was afraid, and she was doing it anyway, which she understood now was not courage, but simply the arithmetic of having no better option. Daria began building the transmission package. 38 minutes remaining. The call came at minute 19. Lucien's phone. He looked at the screen, and Seraphina watched something happen in his face that she hadn't seen before. A fraction of a second where his control system flickered, gone immediately. But she saw it. He answered. Listened for 10 seconds. Where, he said. Then, how long ago? Then he hung up. He looked at Marco first. Marco was already reaching under his jacket. We have company, Lucien said. 2 vehicles, via Tertulliano, moving this direction. ETA 4 minutes. He looked at Daria. How much of the package is done? 60%. Can you transmit 60% in a way that's still actionable? Daria's hands didn't stop moving. If I prioritize the account structures and the political correspondence, yes, give me 90 seconds. You have 90 seconds. Lucien, Seraphina stood. Who called you? One of my people. Which one? He looked at her. The one you trust, she said, or the one you don't. The silence in that half second was a sentence. I don't know yet, he said, which is why we're leaving. If we leave before the transmission, Daria transmits from here. We move the chip. He crossed to the kitchen in 4 strides, picked up the chip reader, disconnected it, handed the chip to Seraphina with the focused precision of someone who has run this calculation and landed. The chip has to stay separate from the transmission. If they take the chip, the transmission is still in transit. If they intercept the transmission, the chip still exists. We split the asset. And if they take the chip and the transmission, then we've lost. He said it plainly. But that's the minimum risk configuration. Seraphina closed her hand around the chip. Such a small thing. She looked at Daria, still typing, 90 seconds becoming 60, becoming 30. She looked at her mother, who had stood and was watching the process with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting 18 months to see this exact moment and was not going to look away from it. "Mom," she said. "Go," Genevieve said. "I'm staying with Daria until it transmits." "You can't, Seraphina." Her mother's voice was steel and something under the steel that Seraphina didn't have time to examine. "Go, I'll be right behind you." Marco was already at the back exit. Lucien was beside her. She went. The laundry room exit opened onto a narrow passage between buildings, just wide enough for one person, running between two property walls to a side street. Seraphina went through it fast, the cold air hitting her face, her heels on the stone going louder than she wanted. Lucien a step behind her with his hand briefly at her back in the passage where it narrowed further. They came out onto a side street and she heard it before she saw it. The sound of a vehicle coming fast from the left. Not a sound consistent with residential morning traffic. Too quick and too deliberate. "Right," Lucien said. She went right. They moved through two more streets, cutting through a gap between a hardware store and a laundry, emerging onto a wider road where Lucien made a call in motion, 2 words, a location. And 40 seconds later a car she didn't recognize pulled to the curb, and the driver, a young man with a blank expression, leaned across to push the passenger door open without being asked. They got in. The car moved. Seraphina looked at her hand. The chip was there, between her fingers. The reader disconnected. The raw chip, the size of a thumbnail print. "Daria?" she said. Lucien had his phone to his ear, waiting. Then, "Go ahead." He listened. He lowered the phone. "Transmission sent," he said. 63% of the package. Account structures, political correspondence, wire confirmations going back 4 years. Seraphina exhaled. "And Daria?" "Out the front before they arrived." A pause. "My people confirmed they entered the building. They'll find an empty flat and a wiped laptop." "My mother." "With Daria." He looked at her. "She made it." Seraphina pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for exactly 1 second. Then she put it down. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere to regroup and decide the next move." "We need to transmit the rest of the chip." "I know." "We need to send it to the ICC contact." "I know, Seraphina." His voice was not unkind, but it was tight. "Give me 10 minutes." She gave him 10 minutes. The car moved through Milan, the city fully awake now. Ordinary people on their way to ordinary things, the specific invisibility of a crisis moving through a crowd that doesn't know it's there. She watched the streets. She held the chip. She thought about her father and Emilio Valle's careful hands, and the 8 months of secret work, and the morning he'd pressed the necklace into her palm and said, "Don't lose it," and she had promised. She had not lost it. She was going to finish it. The car turned onto a wider road and she registered the route, heading south, away from the center, toward the industrial fringe of the city. She was about to ask where they were going when her phone buzzed. Not Lucien's phone, which she'd been using. Her own phone, which she'd been keeping silent. Unknown number. Milan Exchange. She looked at Lucien. He looked at the screen. "Don't answer it," he said. She answered it. The voice on the other end was unhurried and pleasantly modulated, the voice of a man who had never in his life needed to raise it. "Miss Vale," Vittorio Salazar said, "I think we should speak before this goes any further." Her hand tightened on the phone. Lucien reached for it. She moved it slightly away from him and held his gaze. 1 second, a request and a statement simultaneously, and he stopped. "I'm listening," she said. "I understand you've been very busy this morning." A pause. "I want you to know that I have no interest in harming you. Your father made a choice that created a problem, and that problem needs to be resolved. I am calling to offer you a resolution that doesn't require anyone else to be hurt. My father was murdered. Your father had a cardiac event." The pleasantness of his voice didn't shift at all. "These things happen to men under significant stress. I was sorry to hear it. You're going to want to try harder than that." A slight pause. When he spoke again, the pleasantness had not left, but something had joined it. "You have approximately 40% of your father's records still unsent, Miss Vale. The transmission your associate sent this morning is, I'll be honest with you, significant. It will cause disruptions. I won't pretend otherwise. But 63% of a case is not a case. The structures that matter most were in the sections your associate ran out of time to include." Another pause. I can tell you specifically which files your father considered most critical, if you'd like confirmation of that. Ice moved through her. How do you know what was transmitted? Because I know what Emilio built. A pause. He was thorough, but he made one error. He kept a mirror index, a master list of his files in which he considered most critical, a navigation document, you might say. He stored it separately from the chip. A pause. I've had the index for 14 months. Seraphina processed this in the 3 seconds she had. If Salazar had the index, he knew exactly what had been sent and what hadn't. He knew the remaining 40% contained the most critical files. He knew the transmission was incomplete. He knew the chip was the only thing that made it actionable. What do you want? She said. The chip. His voice was almost gentle. That's all. You give me the chip, the 40% stays unsent, and what's already gone. Well, it will take investigators years to work through without the index to guide them. By then, certain structures will have been reorganized. It's inconvenient, not fatal. And in exchange? You go back to Boston. Your mother resumes her life. Nobody connected to you is harmed. A pause. I'm a businessman, Miss Vale. This is a negotiation, not a threat. She looked at Lucien. He was watching her with the acute attention of a man reading a conversation from the hearing of one side, his jaw set, his eyes calculating. She looked at the chip in her other hand. Her father's work. 6 years going backward, 8 months of building, everything distilled to this. I'll need time to consider, she said. Of course. His voice was almost warm. 2 hours. Then I'll need an answer. He hung up, silence in the car. The driver kept his eyes on the road. Lucien watched her. He has the index, she said. He knows what's in the remaining 40%. Lucien processed this. She watched him. Something was moving behind his eyes that she didn't have a name for yet. Say that again, he said. He has a mirror index, a document my father kept separately from the chip listing what files he considered most critical. She watched Lucien's face. He's had it for 14 months, which means someone gave it to him. Yes. Someone who knew Emilio was building the record. Someone with access to his work. Yes. Lucien's face had gone very still. Not the careful stillness of a man managing his response. The involuntary stillness of a man absorbing a blow. Lucien, she said carefully, who did my father trust enough to show the index to? The driver kept his eyes on the road. Seraphina looked in the back of the driver's head. Young man. Blank expression. The car she'd gotten into in 4 seconds on a street in Lambrate because Lucien had called 2 words and it had arrived. She looked at Lucien. She said very quietly, Who called you 20 minutes ago to tell you the vehicles were coming? Lucien turned slowly to look at the driver. The driver's shoulders were absolutely still. Marco sent you, Lucien said. His voice was barely audible. The driver said nothing. Marco called me to warn us, and Marco sent you. Lucien's voice had taken on a quality like cold water running over stone, absolutely flat, absolutely even, and underneath it something that was going to be devastating when it broke the surface. Marco has been running 2 lines. The driver's hand moved toward the door panel. Lucien had his arm across the front seat before the motion completed, his forearm against the driver's throat, controlled and immediate. The car swerved. Seraphina grabbed the door handle. Pull over, Lucien said. The driver pulled over. What happened in the next 90 seconds was brief and brutal and clinical, and Seraphina watched it happen with the specific detachment she used in a trauma bay when the situation demanded function over feeling. Lucien was not cruel about it. He was simply thorough. The driver ended up outside the car, on the pavement, alive and intactly, if significantly not comfortable, with Lucien's hand gripping the front of his jacket. What does Marco know? Lucien said. Everything, the driver said. His voice was a young man's voice. He looked about 22. He looked terrified in the way of someone who understood they had badly miscalculated the situation they'd entered. He's been feeding Salazar since the gala, since you made contact with the girl. Since the gala, Lucien said. He said it was just information, that nobody was going to get hurt. The young man's eyes were wide and sincere with the sincerity of someone who had told themselves a story and believed it. He said it was just information. Where is Marco now? I don't know. Where is he taking the women? The young man's eyes flinched. Seraphina was out of the car. Where? She said. Her voice surprised her. Not loud, not shaking, just flat and direct and carrying a weight she didn't entirely recognize as her own yet. Where's Marco taking them? A warehouse, the young man said. Near the Darsena docks. I don't have the address, I just know the direction. Seraphina looked at Lucien. Lucien looked at her. In the October morning light on a quiet street in the southern industrial fringe of Milan, with the chip in her hand and Salazar's 2-hour clock already running, and Marco somewhere between here and the Darsena docks with her mother and Daria, Seraphina Vale felt the last version of herself. The careful, distanced, Boston medical student version, who had been constructed over 3 years specifically to stand outside all of this, simply ceased to function. She felt something colder and quieter take its place. Not transformation, not a moment of cinematic becoming, just the pragmatic death of the self that couldn't do what came next, and the equally pragmatic emergence of the one that could. She looked at the chip. She looked at Lucien. Tell me where you keep your weapons, she said. The weapons were in the trunk of a second car, a gray Alfa Romeo parked 2 streets over that Lucien accessed with a key from his jacket pocket without explanation, which told Seraphina this was not the first time he had needed a car that nobody knew about within walking distance of a situation gone wrong. He opened the trunk. She looked at what was inside. Take the 9mm, he said, not the other one. I've never fired a handgun. I know. He picked up the 9mm, checked it with the automatic efficiency of muscle memory. Chamber, safety, and held it out to her grip first. It's not complicated. You point it at something and you make a decision. The mechanical part is secondary. She took it. The weight of it was wrong in a way she couldn't articulate. Too dense for its size, the density of a thing whose entire purpose was concentrated into a single function. She held it the way she'd seen it done, which was not the same as knowing how, and she was honest with herself about that gap, in the same way she was honest about the gaps in her clinical knowledge. Name the gap. Work with it. Don't pretend. Lucien took the other weapon, larger, darker, and 2 additional items from a lockbox bolted to the floor of the trunk that she didn't examine. He closed the trunk. He looked at her. If we find them in that warehouse, he said, and there are armed people between us and them, you do not try to be a hero. You stay behind cover, you keep the 9mm pointed at threats, and you move when I tell you to move. And if you go down, then you improvise. That's not a plan. No. He held her gaze. It's not. But we don't have time for a plan. We have 90 minutes before Salazar's deadline, and a 20-minute drive to the Darsena docks, and no guarantee your mother and Daria are even there. He paused. We can sit here and build a plan, or we can go. She was already walking to the passenger door. The young driver, who had given them a cross street and a general direction before Lucien had left him sitting on the pavement with zip ties around his wrists, and a phone call into a contact who would retrieve him in approximately 1 hour, had said near the water, There's an old fish processing facility, big blue doors. It's been empty for 2 years. It wasn't much. It was enough. Lucien drove. Seraphina sat with the handgun in her lap and the chip in her breast pocket, against her sternum where the pendant used to be. And she thought about Marco. Marco with his professional invisibility, his positioning near doors, his efficient silences. Marco, who had been standing in the kitchen of the Lambrate flat when Lucien told her about Porta Genova. Marco, who had stepped into the back hallway to make a call and come back with his face arranged into neutral. She thought about trust as a system with vulnerabilities. Her father had been a forensic accountant. He had understood vulnerabilities the way she was beginning to understand them, not as failures of character, but as architectural weaknesses that careful people mapped and careless people discovered too late. How long has Marco been with you? She asked. 7 years. Lucien's voice was even. She'd learned by now what it cost him to keep it that way. He came to me through a referral I trusted completely. He was thorough, loyal, professionally reliable in every way I could measure. A pause. I didn't measure far enough. He knew everything, most of it. The city was thinning at the edges now, the residential giving way to industrial, the buildings getting lower and more functional. The Gala, Porta Genova, the flat in Lambrat. He paused. The flat I've had for 6 years and used maybe a dozen times. He knew it because 3 years ago I sent him there to retrieve something when I was out of the country. A pause. That's the thing about long relationships. The longer they go, the more the person knows. and you stop auditing them because the relationship itself becomes the evidence of trustworthiness. My father trusted someone too, she said. Yes. The index. He kept it separately from the chip, which means he thought separating them was a layer of protection. But someone knew about the index. Someone he worked with. Someone with access to his process. She thought about this. He had an assistant, a man named Ferrante. Not the Signora from the gala, a different Ferrante. He'd worked with my father for 11 years. Lucien was quiet for a moment. Ferrante died 8 months ago, he said. She looked at him. Cardiac event, he said. The words sat in the car like a third occupant. How many people has Salazar killed? She said. It wasn't a question. With that method specifically? Lucien turned off the main road, heading toward the flat gray light that came off the canal district in the mornings. In my knowledge, 4, possibly 5, if Ferrante is one of his. He paused. Salazar is not a man who enjoys violence. He prefers the appearance of natural causes. It's cleaner, it generates no investigation, and it fits the profile of a man who thinks of himself as civilized. Another pause. That's the most dangerous kind. She could see the water now through gaps between buildings. The Darsena Basin, Milan's inland port, flat and gray-green under the October sky. The neighborhood here was different. Industrial buildings in various states of use and abandonment, chain-link fencing, the particular smell of water mixed with diesel and old metal. There, she said, the blue doors. They were large, freight-sized, the kind designed for loading dock trucks, painted a blue that had oxidized to gray-green in patches, the original color visible only in the sheltered corners. The building behind them was 3 stories of brick and corrugated metal, the windows on the upper levels covered with boards or broken, the lower level sealed. A single car was parked outside, a dark sedan she didn't recognize. One car. Marco came alone, she said. He wouldn't need a team for 2 women he was already controlling. Lucien pulled the Alpha to the curb, 2 buildings away, cut the engine. He studied the facility for 30 seconds with the systematic focus of someone running spatial calculations. There'll be a side entrance. These old processing facilities always have a secondary access on the water side for small boat deliveries. You're going in from the water side. We're going in from the water side. She looked at the handgun, made a decision about it that she filed away without examining too closely. If Marco is expecting a call from the driver and doesn't get it, he already knows something went wrong. We have to assume that. Lucien opened his door. We move fast, or we don't move at all. The water side of the building was accessed through a gap in the chain link that had been cut long enough ago that the edges had rusted to a curve. The dock here was cracked concrete, weeds pushing through the joints, the canal sluggish and dark alongside it. The secondary entrance was a metal door, heavy, the lock showing recent use. No rust on the latch mechanism, the frame wiped clean. Lucien tried the handle. Locked. He produced something from his jacket that he applied to the lock with focused quiet, and 22 seconds later the door opened. He looked at her once before he went through. She went through behind him. The interior of the building was cold and dim, the kind of cold that lived in places that hadn't been heated in years, deep cold, settled into the walls and the concrete floor and the metal ceiling structure above. The light came from the windows on the water side, grimy and diffuse, and from further in, from somewhere past the large empty space of the former processing floor, a different quality of light. Artificial. A lamp or a phone screen, she couldn't determine. She could hear voices. One voice. Marco's voice, low and controlled, speaking in Italian. Lucien put his hand back briefly, a gesture she read immediately as stop. And she stopped. He moved forward along the wall, using the structural pillars for cover, moving the way she'd watched surgeons move in an operating theater when things were going wrong. No wasted motion, every step deliberate. The economy of a person who understands that speed and noise are not the same thing. She followed him. They came to the edge of the processing floor where it met a smaller secondary space, a supervisor's area maybe, or a break room, with 3 walls still standing and a door frame, but no door. The lamp was a work light, battery-operated, casting a yellow circle on the concrete. In the circle of light, her mother. Genevieve Vale was seated on a metal chair, her wrists zip-tied to the armrests, her coat torn at one shoulder where she'd clearly not gone without a fight. She was upright, chin level, her expression containing a fury so controlled and so cold that it looked almost like calm. Almost. Beside her, similarly restrained, sat Daria. A cut on her forehead, dried blood on her cheek, her eyes alert and moving. Marco stood with his back to the doorway, phone to his ear. He was perhaps 5 feet from the women, positioned between them and the only visible exit into the main floor, not holding a weapon, but with the particular stillness of someone who had one accessible. Seraphina looked at Lucien. He held up 2 fingers, gestured to the right side of the doorway. She understood. He was taking the left, she was taking the right, and when he moved, she needed to be moving simultaneously, so that Marco's field of attention was split between 2 directions before he could orient to either. She positioned herself to the right of the doorframe. Her heart was doing something loud and her hands were steady, which she filed as a useful dissociation. Lucien moved. It happened fast. Not dramatically fast, just the fast of a trained body executing a decision before the thinking brain could interfere. He was through the doorframe and had his weapon up and was saying, "Marco," put it down before Marco had fully turned, and for one compressed second the room was a held breath. Marco dropped the phone. He did not put his hand up. He looked at Lucien with an expression that Seraphina, coming through the right side of the doorframe with the 9mm doing its job of existing in her grip, read as something between calculation and resignation. The face of a man who had made a series of decisions and was now standing at their conclusion. "How long?" Lucien said. His voice was the flattest she had heard it, flatter than when he was being careful. This was past careful. "Lucien? How long?" Marco looked at him for a moment, then, 14 months. "Since before Emilio died." Marco said nothing. "You were feeding Salazar while Emilio was still alive." Lucien's weapon didn't move. His voice didn't move. While he was still building the record, while he still thought he was working in, he stopped. "How much did you give them?" "The index." Marco's voice was flat and professional, the voice of a man delivering a report. Timeline of the construction, key contacts he was using. "I didn't know what they were going to do with it." "You didn't know?" Lucien repeated it like he was examining an object. "You gave a man like Salazar a timeline and a contact list for an operation that could destroy him, and you didn't know." "I needed the money." The simplicity of it was almost obscene. "I had debts. Salazar's people approached me through someone I owed. It was supposed to be one transaction." "And Emilio?" Marco looked at the floor. Once, then back up. "I didn't know they were going to move on him. I gave them the index and they said the matter was resolved and I didn't ask what that meant." The silence in the room was the kind that has weight. Seraphina watched her mother's face during this exchange. Genevieve's expression had not changed, the same controlled fury, the same level chin. But her hands, restrained on the armrests, had gone white at the knuckles. Not fear. Rage that had no exit. "Get my mother out of that chair," Seraphina said. Her voice came out steady and cold and surprised her again. She was beginning to understand that the version of her that had emerged on the street in the industrial fringe was going to keep surprising her for a while. Marco looked at her. "Now," she said. He looked at Lucien. Lucien didn't give him permission or deny it, just held the aim and the silence and let the situation exert its own pressure. Marco crossed to Genevieve and cut the zip ties with a knife from his jacket pocket. He did the same for Daria. Genevieve stood up. She did not rub her wrists. She did not look at her hands or adjust her coat or do any of the things a person does when they've been physically restrained and released. She stood and she looked at Marco for exactly 2 seconds with an expression that Seraphina recognized from 23 years of being her daughter. The expression that meant, "I am cataloging this in a place where I will never lose it." And then she turned to Seraphina. "The chip," she said. Seraphina touched her breast pocket. "Here. Daria needs 15 minutes and a connection." Her mother's voice was completely operational. "The remaining 40%. We finished the transmission." "Salazar's deadline is in," Seraphina checked, "73 minutes. Then we have 73 minutes to make it irrelevant." Genevieve looked at Lucien. "Your phone?" "My phone is compromised." "Not the line Daria uses." She held out her hand, the gesture of a woman who had been sitting in a chair with her wrists bound for 40 minutes and was done waiting for other people to be the decision-makers in her life. "Give it to her." Lucien gave it to her. Daria was already on her feet, her shoulder bag somehow still with her. Marco apparently hadn't thought to search it, which told Seraphina something about Marco's assumptions regarding women carrying technical equipment. Daria pulled the laptop, opened it on the floor of the concrete room, and connected to the phone's line with the focused urgency of someone who understood the arithmetic. Seraphina looked at Marco. Lucien was still holding the weapon on him. The situation had a logic to it that everyone in the room understood. Marco stood with his hands at his sides, neither cooperative nor resistant, in the particular way of a man who had run his options and found them all closed. Salazar is going to call me in 73 minutes, Seraphina said to him. He thinks I have the chip, and I'm going to hand it over to make this go away. Does he know about you being caught? Marco looked at her. Not yet. If he calls you first? He won't. He runs me through an intermediary. Name. A man called Renzo. I have a number, not an address. She filed this. When he calls me and I don't give him what he wants, what does he do? He escalates. Marco said it without inflection. He has people in the city. He'll move to direct action. Against me specifically. Against anything he needs to remove. A pause. He's not someone who absorbs failure and adjusts his expectations downward. He closes the problem. By which you mean he kills people. By which I mean he closes the problem. Seraphina looked at the chip in her hand. 63% transmitted. 37% still on the chip. The most critical 37%. The account structures and the political names that Salazar had told her were the difference between a disruption and a demolition. Daria's fingers moving on the keyboard. 14 minutes remaining in the transmission build. 59 minutes until Salazar's deadline. The math was workable. Barely. Workable. What is Salazar's direct exposure in the remaining files? Seraphina asked. Not Marco. Daria. Daria looked up briefly. His personal account numbers are in the final section. 2 of them. Shell structures that trace back to him specifically rather than the broader network. Without those, you can prosecute the network, but the link to him personally is circumstantial. She went back to the keyboard. With those, he goes directly. He knows that, Seraphina said. He knows that, Daria confirmed, which was why he'd offered the deal. Not to suppress the evidence, 63% was already gone, already in the hands of an ICC prosecutor who was presumably opening his encrypted files with significant interest right now. The 63% would damage the network. The remaining 37% would destroy the man. The distinction mattered to Salazar. The distinction mattered to her. 12 minutes, Daria said. Seraphina looked at the doorway back to the main processing floor. She looked at Lucien. If Salazar has people in the city, and he's going to move to direct action when I refuse the deal, she said, how long after that call does he need to put people in motion? 20 minutes, maybe less, depending on positioning. Lucien's eyes were on the doorway. He may already be positioning them. The deadline is a courtesy call, not a real negotiation. He's going to move before I refuse. He may move before you have the chance to. So the 12-minute transmission window is also the window before his people arrive. Lucien looked at her. Yes. She thought about this with the same part of her brain that triaged patients, prioritize, assign resources, except that you cannot control every outcome, control the ones you can. The transmission was Daria's job and she was doing it. The doorway was the threat axis. The chip in her pocket was the asset. Can he take the chip from my pocket and interrupt the transmission if Daria is already sending? She asked. Not if the connection is already established, Daria said without looking up. The send is running. Even if something happens to me, the file transfer continues until it completes or the line is cut. Can they cut the line? They'd have to cut physical infrastructure for this type of connection. It's not a Wi-Fi signal. A pause. They could break Lucien's phone. Don't let anyone break the phone, Seraphina said to Lucien. Noted. The silence in the room was not calm, but it had a structure. Everyone in it understood their function. Even Marco, standing with his hands at his sides in the measured quiet of a man waiting for adjudication, was part of the structure. A known variable, contained, present. 7 minutes. The work light threw its yellow circle, and outside the grimy windows, the Darsena Canal moved in its slow gray way, and somewhere in Milan a man named Vittorio Salazar was checking his watch and running his own calculations about deadlines and leverage, and the question of what a 23-year-old medical student from Boston would do when pressed against the edges of her options. He had miscalculated her. Her father hadn't. Seraphina sat on the concrete floor beside Daria and watched the transmission progress. Baron thought about the morning she'd left for Boston, the weight of the necklace new against her sternum, her father's voice saying, "Call me when you land, Sarah. I mean it." And she had called, and he'd picked up on the first ring. She thought about all the phone calls in 3 years, the ordinary ones about coursework and whether she was eating properly, the specific tenderness of a man who was carrying something enormous and refused to let it touch her voice. She thought, "I'm finishing it, Dad. 4 minutes." Then Marco moved, not toward the door, not toward Lucien. He moved toward the work light, and the motion was so unexpected in direction that it cost Lucien the half-second of reorientation it needed, and in that half-second Marco kicked the light. The room went dark. Seraphina's hand closed on the laptop instinctively, not to protect herself, to protect the device, which told her something about where her priorities had settled in the last 12 hours. She pulled it against her body and got low, and heard the sounds of the room rearranging itself in the dark. Lucien's voice, sharp, 2 words in Italian. Her mother's intake of breath, controlled. Something hitting the floor, footsteps. A crash. Metal on concrete. Then a rectangle of gray light. The doorway, the main processing floor beyond it. Marco's shape moving through it fast. Lucien was moving. "Stay," he said. The word was aimed at the room, not specifically her, and she stayed because the transmission was at 91%, and Daria's hands were still moving, and the logic of the situation was that someone had to be in this room with the laptop and the phone and the 3.5 minutes remaining. She stayed. She sat in the dark with the laptop against her chest, and the handgun in her right hand, and her mother's breathing 6 feet to her left, controlled and steady. And she listened to the sounds from the main processing floor. Footsteps. Something overturned, once the specific sound of impact that meant 2 people in contact. And she watched the progress bar on the laptop screen, the only light in the room, advancing. 94%. 96. 98. The sound from the main floor had stopped. Not resolved. Stopped. The silence was a different kind now. The silence of something interrupted rather than concluded. Then, from the main floor, a voice she had never heard before but recognized immediately from the quality of its calm. The same voice from the phone call, unhurried, pleasantly modulated. "Miss Vale," Vittorio Salazar said, "I'm afraid your deadline has moved up." 99%. Seraphina looked at the doorway. In the gray light from the main floor she could see shapes, 2, 3, 4 people. Salazar somewhere among them. And in the foreground, held by 2 of them, barely on his feet but on his feet, Lucien. A cut above his eye running dark, his jaw set, his hands controlled behind him. Alive. Looking at her. The progress bar reached 100%, transmission complete. Salazar stepped into the doorway and looked down at her on the floor. The laptop, the phone, the light from the completed screen, and she watched his face move through the calculation in real time. Not rage. Something colder and more structural, the expression of a man recalibrating his operational position while still in the field. "It's done," she said. He looked at the screen. He looked at her. And then Vittorio Salazar did something she had not anticipated in any scenario she'd run in the last 73 minutes. He smiled. Small and almost genuine, the way a chess player smiles when they see a move they didn't expect and can't help respecting it. "Yes," he said quietly. "It is." He looked back at his people. He looked at Lucien, still held between 2 of them, blood running down the side of his face, watching Salazar with the contained assessment of a man determining whether the next 30 seconds required him to die or not. And Salazar said to them, in a voice that was still pleasant, still unhurried, still carrying the particular quality of a man who had never once needed to shout, "Kill them." The work light came back on. Someone had found the switch. In the sudden yellow light of the processing room, Seraphina Vale stood up from the concrete floor with a handgun she had never fired, and a father's work already moving through encrypted channels toward a prosecutor in The Hague, and she looked at Vittorio Salazar across 8 feet of cold air, and for the first time in 23 years she was not her father's careful daughter, or her mother's managed project, or Boston's diligent student, or anyone's anything. She was just the person in the room. And the person in the room was not going to let this be how it ended. The first gunshot came from somewhere she didn't expect. The first gunshot came from the waterside door. Not from Seraphina. Not from Lucien. From the rectangle of gray daylight at the back of the processing floor that she'd come through 40 minutes ago. The door that Lucien had unlocked with something from his jacket pocket. The door she'd assumed was their secret, and apparently wasn't. The shot took out the work light. Darkness again, but different this time. Not the sudden shocking dark of the kicked lamp, but the gray ambient dark of a large industrial space in morning light. The grimy windows doing just enough that shapes were shapes, and movement was movement, and the architecture of the room was legible, if you gave your eyes 3 seconds. She gave them 2. Salazar's people were moving. She could hear it, the heavy purposeful movement of trained men reorienting to a new threat axis. Lucien had used the shot as cover. She heard rather than saw him break from the two holding him, the sounds of that particular and compact violence. A grunt, something hitting the floor. From the waterside door more shapes. 3, maybe 4. Moving fast and low. Genevieve's people. Her mother had said, "Give me until morning, and I have people too," and Seraphina had believed her without fully understanding what that meant. And now she understood it in the most concrete possible terms. Armed men coming through a dock door in a fish processing facility in the Darcina Industrial District, and the specific controlled chaos of a space where allegiances were clear and the geometry was violent. Seraphina pressed herself against the interior wall and kept the 9mm up, and did what Lucien had told her, stayed behind cover, kept the weapon pointed at threats, waited to move. The laptop was under her arm, useless now as a device, but present as a record, and the chip was against her sternum in her breast pocket, and the transmission was done, and she held those 2 facts like weight-bearing walls while everything around her moved and broke and reconfigured. 40 seconds of compressed time that her memory would later compress further, not into clarity, but into fragments. The sound of Salazar's voice, no longer pleasant, sharp, and operational, Italian too fast for her to follow. A figure crossing her field of vision that wasn't Lucien, and her hands making the decision to track it before she consciously directed them. The feeling of the trigger under her finger, the specific resistance of it, and the moment she chose not to pull, not from hesitation, but from the recognition that the figure was already going down from a different direction and her involvement was redundant. She did not fire the 9mm. She would think about that later. Whether it was calculation or something older and more fundamental, she wouldn't know for months. What she knew in the moment was that she was a person who repaired damage to human bodies, not a person who created it. And even standing in the middle of this, she was not willing to become the other kind of person without absolute necessity. The absolute necessity didn't arrive. What arrived instead, in under 2 minutes, was quiet. The processed, post-violence quiet of a room where the movement has stopped and people are breathing and taking inventory of themselves and others. Gray light through dirty windows, the smell of concrete and old machine oil, and something sharper that she recognized from the emergency bay and didn't examine. Lucien was on his feet. She found him by his breathing, controlled, deliberate, the deep respiratory effort of someone running the post-incident assessment while managing a pain he wasn't going to acknowledge yet. The cut above his eye was still running. His jacket was gone, his shirt torn at the shoulder. He was scanning the room with the systematic focus of someone counting outcomes. Salazar's 4 men were down. Not all dead. She could see the chest movement on 2 of them, and one was making a sound that she was professionally familiar with, and that required attention, and she was moving toward him before she'd finished the thought, the 9mm still in her hand, kneeling on the concrete in her ruined silk dress, beside a man who'd been about to kill her 60 seconds ago, because that was what she did. That was the only version of herself she was not able to set down regardless of context. Seraphina, Lucien's voice. He needs pressure on this. She was already using the torn hem of her dress. Someone needs to hold this. One of Genevieve's people, a compact woman she hadn't noticed in the chaos, crouched beside her and took over without comment, her hands finding the correct position with practiced efficiency. Seraphina stood. She looked for Salazar. He was not in the room. She felt it before she confirmed it, the specific absence of the room's most significant presence. He had moved when the shooting started, and in the chaos of reorientation he had moved toward the main floor exit, the big blue doors, the way he'd come in. She knew this the way she knew things she couldn't fully source, the accumulation of small observations adding up to a directional conclusion. "He's gone," she said. Lucien crossed to the main floor doorway, looked through, came back. "Car's gone." "How far does he get?" Lucien looked at her. Something moved in his face. "The transmission is complete," she said. "The ICC has 63% plus the remaining 40% including his personal accounts. That went through..." She checked the laptop screen, still showing the completed status. 18 minutes ago. Your contact is an ICC prosecutor. What happens now? Depends on how fast they move. He looked at the screen. And how much political cover Salazar still has. How much does he have? Less than he did 20 minutes ago. He met her eyes. The political names in your father's records. 3 of them are currently serving ministers in 2 EU governments. When that data lands in front of a prosecutor, the first thing those ministers do is activate their own lawyers and start looking for deals. The moment anyone in that network starts looking for a deal, Salazar loses his protection layer. A pause. He knows this. He's not running to safety. He's running to manage the collapse, which means he's calling people right now. Which means everyone he calls is deciding right now whether to answer. She thought about the elegant blade-faced man stepping off a plane at Lenate 40 minutes before his deadline, confident in his leverage. And she thought about how the world had reorganized itself in the 18 minutes since the transmission completed, and she felt something she didn't immediately have a word for. Not satisfaction, too complicated for that. More like the closing of a system, a circuit completing. Her father's 8 months of careful work finally arriving at the destination he'd built it for, carried the last distance by his daughter in a silk dress on the floor of an abandoned fish processing facility, with ruined heels and a handgun she hadn't fired. He would have found that funny. She almost did. Her mother was standing near the waterside door when Seraphina found her, her torn coat pulled close, looking out at the canal. The morning had fully arrived. The light was proper daylight now, the canal moving in its slow gray way, a barge in the distance. Ordinary water on an ordinary morning. Genevieve turned when she heard her daughter's footsteps. They looked at each other. There was a version of this moment that would have been cinematic. The embrace, the released tears, the things unsaid for years finally spoken at the water's edge. That version existed somewhere. It was not the version that happened. What happened was, her mother looked at her face for a long time, reading it the way she'd always read things, thoroughly and without sentimentality. And then she reached out and straightened the collar of Seraphina's dress with both hands, a precise, small gesture. The gesture of a woman who was not able to say the full weight of what she felt and was not going to pretend otherwise, but who needed to do something with her hands. "You look terrible," Genevieve said. "You look worse," Seraphina said. Her mother's mouth moved. The smallest thing. Something between a laugh and the precursor to tears that never arrived, because Genevieve Vale had not cried in public in 30 years, and was not starting today. "He would have hated this," Genevieve said. Meaning the building, the canal, the violence, the whole architecture of the morning. He hated anything that couldn't be managed with paperwork. "He did manage it with paperwork," Seraphina said. In the end, her mother looked at the canal. "Yes," she said. "He did." They stood there for a moment, the two of them, with the canal and the gray morning and the barge moving in the distance, and Seraphina felt her father present in the space between them in the way that people who are gone are sometimes present, not as comfort, exactly, but as dimension. As the reason the space between two people has the particular shape it has. She took the pendant out of her breast pocket. Daria had reseated the chip in its housing before they'd left the kitchen in Lambrate. The star closed again, the seam invisible, the longer point indistinguishable from the others, unless you knew to press. She turned it over in her fingers. Cold gold. Asymmetrical. 1 point longer than the rest. She held it out to her mother. Genevieve looked at it for a moment. Then she shook her head. "Keep it," she said. "Mom, it's yours. It was always yours." She paused. "He chose well, in that regard." Seraphina closed her hand around it. The next 6 hours were bureaucratic and exhausting in the way that the aftermath of crises always is. The logistics of law enforcement contact. The careful construction of a narrative that was truthful without being operationally reckless. The presence of lawyers that Genevieve produced from somewhere with the efficiency of a woman who had kept them on retainer for precisely this contingency. Lucien's wound was cleaned and closed by a medical contact of his own in the back of a car while he made phone calls. Daria disappeared into the city with her shoulder bag and her encrypted laptop and did not say goodbye, which Seraphina respected as a professional courtesy. Marco was in police custody by noon. He said very little, which was either loyalty to a system that no longer existed or the pragmatic silence of a man calculating his next position. Either way, Seraphina found she had no particular feeling about him. Not forgiveness, not rage, just the flat acknowledgement of a person who had made choices and was now in the company of their consequences. The ICC prosecutor, a man named Voss Flemish, whose voice on the phone was careful and urgent and professionally controlled in a way that she immediately recognized as the voice of someone who understood they were holding something seismic, confirmed receipt of all transmitted files at 2:17 in the afternoon. He asked 3 questions. She answered them. He said he would be in touch. He was in touch the following morning, but that was not today. Today, by 3 o'clock, Seraphina was sitting on the floor of her father's apartment in the Brera district with her back against the cold radiator, and a glass of red wine she was actually drinking this time, the pendant on the coffee table in front of her, the city going about its business outside the window. The apartment still smelled like him. It was still exactly as he'd left it. She was beginning to think she understood why her mother hadn't touched it. Not grief exactly, but the same quality of precision that had defined him. Leave the evidence intact. You never know when you'll need it. Her phone buzzed. Lucien. A text, not a call. 4 words. Are you all right? Not a question mark. He didn't do question marks in text messages, she was learning. He stated things directly and let the other person determine the grammar. She thought about the question. The honest answer was complex enough to require more than a text message, so she gave him the functional version. Sitting on the floor, drinking wine. Yes. A pause. Then, good floor or bad floor? She looked around her father's apartment. The shelves of books he'd organized by subject, and then reorganized by color when the subject stopped mattering to him. The desk in the corner with the lamp that had a crack in the shade he'd never replaced. The framed photograph of the 3 of them at the Ligurian coast when she was 9. Her father's face turned toward the camera with an expression she now read differently than she used to. Not happiness, exactly. Gratitude. The specific gratitude of a man who understood he was standing in the best moment of his life while he was still in it. Good floor, she typed. Another pause. Longer. I'll be in Boston at the end of the month. If you're back by then. She looked at this message for a while. She thought about the balcony in the October rain, the restaurant with the bad champagne and the good honesty, the car, the flat, the kitchen table, and the photograph of Salazar and her mother's hands white-knuckled on the armrests and Daria's fingers moving and the progress bar reaching 100%. She thought about what he'd said in the dark of the spare room of the Lambrate flat. Your father used to talk about you like the fact of you kept everything else from swallowing him. She understood that now in a way she hadn't at 2 in the morning when she was operating on adrenaline and emergency clarity. She understood it now in the quiet of her father's apartment with the wine and the floor and the ordinary late afternoon light coming through the window. Her father had loved her with the desperate, specific love of a man who needed something to be worth protecting. She had been that thing. She didn't resent it. She just saw it clearly now, from the other side of a day that had cost her the last of her comfortable ignorance. She wasn't going back to ignorance. She wasn't going back to the careful, constructed distance of Boston Seraphina, who studied hard and called home on Sundays, and told herself the geography was enough to keep the other world separate. But she was going back to Boston. She was going to finish what she'd started there, not as escape now, but as intention. She was going to become a physician because she wanted to, because it was the work she was built for, because her father had talked about her in dark rooms to a man like Lucien Moretti, and what he'd said was, she's going to save people and she was going to make that true. She picked up her phone. I'll be back before the end of the month, she typed. Come find me. She set the phone down. She picked up the pendant. She turned it over in her fingers for a long time, examining it, the hinge that was invisible, the seam that was only findable if you knew it was there, the longer point that carried its secret so perfectly that it had rested against her sternum for 3 years without ever announcing itself. Her father's engineering. His forensic accountant's mind applied to the problem of keeping something safe inside the ordinary world. She clasped it back around her neck. The weight of it was different now, not heavier exactly, but more present, more known. The difference between carrying something without understanding it and carrying it with full information about what it was and what it cost. She sat with that for a while. Vittorio Salazar was detained at the Swiss border at 11:40 that night, attempting to cross in a vehicle registered to a shell company that Emilio Val had documented in the 3rd section of the transmitted files. The border agent who stopped him had been briefed 3 hours earlier by Europol, working from the ICC prosecutor's preliminary review. He was transferred to ICC custody within 48 hours. The detention was not made public for another 6 days, by which time 3 sitting ministers in 2 EU governments had already retained counsel, and 2 of them had begun preliminary cooperation discussions. The Meridian Group's financial architecture collapsed over the following 3 weeks, as the account structures Emilio had documented were frozen across 11 jurisdictions simultaneously. The speed of the collapse surprised even the investigators. It indicated a system that had been under internal stress for some time, held in place by Salazar's personal authority, and which fell readily once that authority was removed. Seraphina read about it in pieces, over time, in the way you read about things that you were inside before they became history. Each piece felt both larger and smaller than the experience had been. Larger because the scale of what her father had documented was more visible now in the public record. Smaller because the public record had no way of containing the kitchen table in Lambrate, or her mother's hands on the armrests, or the specific sound of the progress bar reaching 100% in the dark. She thought about that gap often, between what happened and what could be said about what happened. She thought her father would have understood it. He'd spent his professional life in that gap, building the case that the visible world was not the whole story, that the numbers underneath told a different truth. She supposed she was his daughter in that way too. Milan, 4 months later. The Foundation took over the Veil Group's charitable arm in January, Genevieve's project, built with the methodical determination of a woman who had spent 18 months in enforced stillness and was not going to spend another day not moving. Its stated mission was support for victims of organized financial crime and their families, which was specific enough to be meaningful and broad enough to reach the people it needed to reach. Genevieve ran it with the same focused precision she applied to everything, which meant it was functional and well-resourced and slightly terrifying in its efficiency. She and Seraphina had dinner in Milan in January, in a restaurant that was nothing like Dal Pescatore. Brightly lit, loud, full of families and noise and the ordinary music of people eating together. They talked for 3 hours, not about Salazar or the chip or the warehouse by the docks, about her father, about what he was like before all of it. The version who organized his books by color and cracked bad jokes at breakfast, and taught Seraphina to play chess on rainy Sundays with a patience that had seemed infinite because it was, for her specifically, infinite. Her mother cried once, briefly, into her wine glass, and then straightened and did not mention it. They split the bill. At the end of the evening, standing outside in the cold January street, Genevieve put her hand on Seraphina's face for a moment. Both palms, the gesture of a woman doing the thing she could never say directly, which was, "I see you and you are real, and I was afraid of losing you before I ever fully had you." Seraphina held still for it, didn't deflect, let it be received. Then her mother dropped her hands and pulled her coat straight and said, "Go back to Boston. Finish what you started." "I'm going tomorrow," Seraphina said. "Good." Her mother looked at her once more, in the streetlight, with the expression that Seraphina was finally learning to read fully. Not management, not performance, not the careful architecture of a woman controlling her environment. Just love, expressed in the only register Genevieve Vale had ever been fluent in, directness and will, and the expectation that you were strong enough to receive it without it being softened. "Your father would be proud," her mother said. She said it simply, without ceremony, and then turned and walked to her car. Seraphina stood on the street for a moment. The city moved around her in its ordinary way. People passing, a couple arguing quietly in the doorway of a pharmacy, a child dragging a reluctant parent toward a gelato window. The everyday, irreducible texture of a world that continued its business, regardless of what had burned and collapsed and rebuilt in its margins. She pressed her hand to her sternum, felt the pendant. Boston, late February. The emergency bay at Boston General on a Tuesday night was exactly what it always was. Controlled chaos operating inside a system designed to absorb it, the particular rhythm of triage and treatment, and the constant low-level calculus of limited resources against unlimited need. Seraphina moved through it with the focused economy she'd spent 2 years developing and which had, in October, been tested against a very different kind of emergency and had held. She was suturing a 3-centimeter laceration on the forearm of a 19-year-old who was trying very hard not to look at what she was doing, when her attending found her to say there was someone in the waiting area asking for her. She finished the suture, cleaned her hands, pulled off her gloves. Lucien was standing near the entrance with his coat wet from the snow that had started an hour ago, slightly out of place in the fluorescent institutional light, in the way that a man built for darker and more complicated spaces is always slightly out of place in the clean pragmatism of a hospital. He was holding 2 cups of coffee from the cart in the lobby. He looked tired in this particular way that had become familiar to her. The tiredness of someone who was dismantling a complicated life one piece at a time and finding the process slower and more excavating than expected. She'd known from his calls over the past months that it was real. The winding down of the operations, the legitimate restructuring, the gradual removal of himself from a world he'd inhabited for 30 years. She'd known it wasn't clean or easy. There was nothing clean about extricating yourself from 3 decades of complicated allegiance and consequence. But he was doing it with the same method he applied to everything, methodically, without drama, at the pace required rather than the pace desired. He held out a coffee. She took it. "You look terrible," she said. "I've been told." He looked around the emergency bay with the evaluative gaze of someone assessing an environment. "This is where you work. This is where I work. It suits you." He said it plainly. Not a compliment, not a flattery, an observation. "The noise doesn't bother you." "The noise helps," she said. "It's harder to drift when it's loud." He looked at her. That same quality of attention she'd first recognized on a balcony in October. Not invasive, just present. Actually, there. "How long do you have?" he asked. 40 minutes, then I'm back on." 40 minutes is enough. For what? "To drink terrible hospital coffee and tell you that I sold the Lambrate flat last week." He looked at the cup in his hand. Seemed like the right time. She thought about the Lambrate flat, the deadbolts and the 2 exits and the blanket on the top shelf of the closet, the kitchen table where all of it had begun to assemble into something she could see the shape of, the cold radiator she hadn't had the chance to sit against. "Good," she said. "I'm keeping the Milan apartment." He looked at her. "And I have a meeting with a commercial developer here in March. There's a project, mixed use, affordable housing component, nothing glamorous. The kind of thing that takes 2 years and ends up being a building people actually live in. You're going to build things. I spent a long time dismantling things." He said it without self-pity, just the flat accounting of a man doing honest arithmetic on his own ledger. "Seems reasonable to try the other direction." She looked at him in the fluorescent light with the snow coming down outside the glass doors and the emergency bay making its ordinary, extraordinary noise behind her. And she thought about all the ways this was improbable. The age difference, the history, the world he was leaving and the one she was building, the specific improbability of 2 people who had met on a balcony in the rain and survived a warehouse by a canal and were now standing in a Boston hospital on a Tuesday in February drinking bad coffee. She thought her father had trusted him. She thought so did she. Not blindly. She was constitutionally incapable of blind trust, which was one of the more useful things she'd inherited from both her parents. But with clear eyes and full information and the specific quality of trust that is not the absence of knowledge but the presence of it. 40 minutes, she said. 40 minutes, he agreed. They sat down in the waiting area, which was the least romantic possible location and suited them both exactly, and they drank the bad coffee while the snow accumulated outside and the emergency bay continued its work behind them, and the city went about its enormous ordinary life. And it was enough. It was in fact more than enough. It was the kind of thing her father had spent 8 months of secret work and the remainder of his life trying to protect. Not the evidence, not the record, not the architecture of justice he'd built in a chip smaller than a grain of rice. But this, the possibility of this. 2 people in a lit room with nowhere to be but here, with no performance required and no cage to escape and no inheritance of silence to manage. Just the present tense, plain and available and chosen. Outside, the snow came down over Boston in the particular way it comes down over old cities, without apology, without destination, covering everything equally. The streets and the rooftops and the hospital entrance and the bench where a man had left 2 cigarette butts last Tuesday, and the parking structure where a woman had cried briefly in her car after a difficult shift, and the 1,000 small private geographies of a city living its life. Seraphina turned the pendant between her fingers once, absently, and then let it go. It rested against her sternum where it had always rested. She drank her coffee. She did not look at the clock. End.